This is St. Augustine's Confessions. This is the introduction. The life of St. Augustine has a special appeal because he was a great sinner who became a great saint, and greatness is all the more admirable if it is achieved against odds. From his own account, we know that he lived the life of sin until the age of 32, and even after he was intellectually convinced of Christian truth, he was prevented from accepting the faith by weakness in dealing with sexual temptation. In the Confessions, he paints so black a picture of his past that the reader may easily lose sight of the good qualities which he certainly possessed as a young man. Whether he was a greater sinner than the others living in the notorious city of Carthage, we cannot tell. But whatever his vices, they were not without compensating virtues. Some of the most striking passages in the book are those in which he writes of his mother, and it is clear that he was always a good and affectionate son, although he may not have appreciated St. Monica's true worth until after his own conversion. On her deathbed, she told him that she had never heard him speak a harsh word against her, and this is not hard to believe, for whatever other sins he felt himself bound to confess, unkindness to others was not one of them. He showed unusual loyalty, too, to the mistress whom he kept for so many years, and he was truly fond of Adeodatus, the son whom she bore him. Outside his own family, he also had a remarkable gift for making friends. This was in itself a danger, for as a boy it was his love of their company that led him to rob an orchard. Later in adolescence, simply to win their admiration, he used to boast of sins which he had not committed, and it was most probably by their influence and example that he became a regular spectator at the theater, and learned to enjoy the cruel sport of the arena. Yet he did not always allow his friends to lead him into adventures which he would not have undertaken by himself, and there is a point in his favor that he refused to take part in the activities of the rowdies who made it their business to scandalize newcomers to the schools at Carthage. Add to this the obvious fact that he was a serious and studious youth, and it becomes difficult to avoid the conclusion that the terms in which he writes of his sinful past are unnecessarily harsh. Perhaps his training as a teacher of rhetoric accounts for this. He was, after all, trying to make out a case against himself before an audience which was predisposed to believe him as a saintly man. When he wrote the Confessions, he already had a considerable reputation for sanctity, and one of the reasons why he wrote was to persuade his admirers that any good qualities he had were by the grace of God, who had saved him so often from himself. Of all the sins which he wished to confess, there was one which was at the root of all the others. It was not an isolated act or repeated habit, but a condition of mind which was part of his life and provided him with a ready excuse for doing what his conscience told him to be wrong. For when, as a young man, he became curious about the world and its origin, and started to search for the truth, instead of turning to God in simple faith, he accepted the theories by which the Manichees explained away these problems. As a catechumen, he had received some instruction, but he had no clear idea of what Christians believed. As literature, the scriptures compared poorly with the polished prose of Cicero, and he thought them fit only for the simple-minded. He was too conceited to study them, and his reason could not accept his discrepancies and contradictions for which he thought they contained. He could not account for the presence of evil in a world created by God, who is good. Nor could he understand that God is a spiritual being. In his perplexity, he turned to the Manichees, whose specious reasoning seemed to supply the answers to these problems, as well as a system of morals which permitted the blame for sin to be cast elsewhere than on the sinner. The dangers of these beliefs were still very present to St. Augustine when he wrote the Confessions, for it was only 10 or 12 years since he had escaped from them himself. In the meantime, he had written at least 5 books against the Manichees, and no man was better qualified to do so than himself. The Confessions, of course, cannot be considered as simply another work of controversy. They are far too personal for that. But as he wrote them, St. Augustine was conscious above all else that the Manichees were wrong, and that the only mercy of God had saved him from this evil. He was only 18 when he first allied himself with the Manichees. Their founder, Manes, or Mani, a fanatic who regarded himself as the Paraclete, had been crucified in Persia in 277. His religion spread rapidly both during and after his lifetime, and when St. Augustine came under its influence a century later, there were groups of Manichees throughout the Roman world, especially in North Africa. By this time, they were a proscribed sect and were obliged to practice their religion in secret, but numerically, they were strong, and their doctrines with various modifications, survived into the Middle Ages. Mainz did not entirely reject Christianity, but since he held that his teaching was only partially true, he supplemented it by borrowing from other religions and adding his own theories. He alleged that there were inconsistencies in the scriptures, and that the text was corrupt and therefore untrustworthy. In particular, he denied the virgin birth and Christ's crucifixion, since the flesh was tainted with evil and any association with it. In particular, he denied the virgin birth and Christ's crucifixion, since the flesh was tainted with evil and any association with it was unworthy of God. This belief was derived from the fundamental doctrine of Manichaeism, which was that in the beginning there were two independent principles described as good and evil, or light and darkness. The evil power invaded the kingdom of the good power, and in part captured it, so that the two became mixed. Matter was therefore composed partly of good and partly of evil, both being present in a given substance in a greater or smaller degree. Good and evil were permanently in conflict because the captive particles of good or light were always struggling to escape from the evil or darkness which enveloped them. In flesh of all sorts, very few traces of the light element were present, and for this reason, meat was not to be eaten by a good Manichae. Light was present in greater quantities in vegetable matter, which could therefore be eaten. The light particles were freed from imprisonment when the elect, or higher order of Manichaees, ate these foods. But it was wrong for a member of the sect to cut down a tree, or even pluck a fruit, or to commit any other act of violence harmful to the good elements in plants. These operations were to be performed by the wicked on behalf of the Manichaees, that is, by those who were considered as lost souls and belonged to neither the higher nor the lower order of the sect. The elect were supposed to be particularly scrupulous and to avoid either doing violence to the good elements or taking any action which might assist the power of darkness. They were forbidden to marry because the act of procreation was construed as a collusion with these powers. For the lower order of the sect called hearers or aspirants, the rules were less strict, but they were expected to serve the elect and to give food to no one but them, since to do so would be to deliver the good elements into the hands of the devil. It seems incredible that a man of St. Augustine's intellectual caliber could have been taken in by these fantastic theories. But the Manichae's plausible explanation of the problem of evil and his own inability to think of God except as a material being combined to win him over. At first he was convinced by these arguments and even influenced others to accept them. Although he never rose to a higher degree than that of aspirant, he remained with the sect for nearly 10 years, during which he carried out the duties expected of its junior members. But before the end of this period, serious doubts had begun to trouble him. He was assured that Faustus, a leading figure among the Manichaees, would be able to settle all his problems, but when this Solomon proved incompetent, he at length determined to remain a Manichae in name only, while he waited for something better to turn up. Once he had made this decision, his mind was open to other influences. He was introduced to the philosophy of the Neoplatonists, and their books helped him toward a conception of the spiritual nature of God. At the same time, he began to understand that evil results from man's misuse of free will. This was the beginning of conversion. He listened with greater attention to the sermons of St. Ambrose, to which he had first been attracted only by professional interest in the preacher's reputation as a fine speaker. He learned how to approach the scriptures and how to look for the spiritual meaning behind the literal sense. He went on to read St. Paul's epistles, where for the first time he heard of God's mercy and grace and learned to think of Christ as the Redeemer and no longer simply as the specially gifted teacher. Finally, there came the decisive moment when the truth became so clear to him that he could no longer reject it. St. Augustine's decision to keep the faith is of course the central point of the Confessions. After, he continues the narrative in order to include his baptism and the beginning of the return journey to Africa, during which his mother died. This takes us to the end of Book 9, but at this point, the biographical part of the book comes to an end. In Book 10, St. Augustine examines his ability at the time of writing to deal with temptation in its various forms, and Books 11 through 13 are an exposition of the first chapter of Genesis. This apparent lack of cohesion between the two parts of the work has been subject of much debate. though it is generally agreed that Book 10 was a later interpolation inserted to satisfy readers who are naturally curious to know how the faith had changed St. Augustine's life. There is less agreement about the purpose of books 11 through 13. The traditional explanation is that they are no more than an appendix, but this avoids the issue since appendixes are normally added for a definite purpose. Books describe St. Augustine's search for truth, while the last three contain his thoughts upon its meaning after he is found it. Others see a connection between the pattern of the Confessions and St. Augustine's method for the instruction of catechumens. In his work, De Catechizandis Rudibus, written only 4 or 5 years after the Confessions, he suggests that the catechist should first point out to the convert that God has always taken good care of him and then proceed to instruct him in the strict scriptures, starting with the story of creation. This plan of instruction clearly corresponds with the arrangement of the Confessions, and the suggestion is that St. Augustine is applying the method to his own case in retrospect. Another view, more recently put forward, is that St. Augustine's original plan was to write a complete exposition of the faith as it is derived from Scripture, but found it too lengthy a task and abandoned it after he had dealt with the first chapter of Genesis. The story of his own early life and errors was intended merely as a preamble. The evidence in support of this theory is taken chiefly from certain passages in the text, where the author implies that he is hastening to complete the narrative part of his work in order to devote himself to other more important matters. Probably there is some truth in all these explanations, although it is hard to believe that the Confessions as we have received them are the only beginning of a longer work, projected but never finished. Whatever his precise plan may have been, it is unlikely that St. Augustine would have been content merely to repudiate his early errors. His logical mind would require not only that the falsehood should be demolished, but also that the truth should be made apparent. If he was to confess his errors, he must also confess the true beliefs for which he had renounced them, and the foundation of these was to be found in the book of Genesis. What better answer could be made to the Manichaean theory of the twin powers of good and evil than God's own statement that he made heaven and earth, and that he saw what he had made and found it very good? St. Augustine was satisfied that this was all that was needed to reduce the fundamental principle of Manichaeanism to absurdity. If this was how the work was planned, the pattern of the Confessions becomes clear. In the first place, it is a confession of the writer's sin and error. In the second, a recognition of God's goodness and truth. These two purposes are complementary, and the title of the book covers both. In the third place, because he has been saved from error and the truth has been made clear to him, St. Augustine offers praise to God and thanks him for his mercy. He is led from confession of sin to confession of faith, and finally to confession of God's glory. The first words in the book, Magnus est Domine et laudabilis vade, are the key to the whole. There has been no lack of English translators of the Confessions. The first to attempt the task was Sir Toby Matthew, the courtier and diplomat whose version was published anonymously and without imprint at St. Omer in 1620. It contained a long and controversial introduction to which the next translator, William Watts, rector of St. Albans, Wood Street, took objection on ground that it was so apparently partially popish. He began his own translation, which was published in London in 1631, as a Lenten devotion. But he tells us, I quickly found it to exercise more than my devotion. It exercised my skill, all I had. It exercised my patience. It exercised my friends too. For 'tis incomparably the hardest task that ever I yet undertook. Watts was followed by Abraham Woodhead, the Catholic writer who published a translation of the first 10 books in 1660. An anonymous version now recognized as the work of Bishop Challoner appeared in 1739. This also contained only books 1 through 10. Next came E.B. Pusey's revision of Watts, published in 1838, which became the standard translation. Entirely new versions were produced in 1878 by W. H. Hutchings, books 1 through 10, and in 1897 by C. Biggs, books 1 through 9. And in the last quarter of a century, to my knowledge, there have been at least 5 new translations, some of them published in the United States and not easily available in this country. Translators in other languages have also produced their quota. These facts alone are ample evidence of the continued and widespread interest in St. Augustine. for few books have been translated so often into so many languages. In preparing this translation, I decided at the outset to use you rather than thou. Although the confessions, as might be expected, are written in the form of prayer, it seemed to me that in a work of this length it would be merely tiresome to remain the conventional usage. For the sake of consistency, I have also taken the liberty of changing thou to you in the quotations from Scripture. These are from the Knox version and are printed in italics. I have also modified the English text of Knox within strict limits. Wherever St. Augustine modifies the Latin text, that is, wherever he omits a phrase or adds words of his own. Some transposition of words in the English text has also been necessary for grammatical reasons, because St. Augustine frequently combines passages from Scripture, not only with one another, but also with sentences of his own. In a small number of cases, it has been impossible to quote the Knox version, and I have had to content myself with giving the appropriate reference. The reasons for this are several. Too much stress need not be laid upon the first of them, which is that the text from which the saint quotes, presumably from memory, is earlier than the Latin version of St. Jerome. This accounts for some variations in wording. In the second place, while it may be grammatically possible to combine two or more sentences as they are written in one language, it does not necessarily follow that they can be combined in the same way once they have been translated independently into another idiom. Here again, the number of cases is small. Thirdly, in a few passages, the meaning which St. Augustine elicits from the sacred text does not correspond with that given in Knox. The most obvious example is his interpretation of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1-2. He may sometimes have been misled by an ambiguous Latin version, for the whereas Knox translated from the Vulgate in the light of the Hebrew and Greek originals. St. Augustine is known to have had a profound distaste for Greek, and is very doubtful whether he had any knowledge of Hebrew.